Hi, I'm Mellisa Smith.
I'm Spencer Ziegler, and welcome to Data Lit, podcast for educators by educators. Mellisa, we made it. The end of season 6. We're there.
Yeah, so this time of year, when I was in the classroom, I used to play one of my favorite songs. You remember that song, The Final Countdown?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. Don't sing too much. We don't have Wake County budget money to get the royalty for that.
Right.
So hopefully it does not get flagged, because you were definitely on key.
But yes, so that's what this time of year reminds me of. You're coming to an end, you're being reflective about your practices, and it's an exciting time and a sad time at the same time.
Yeah, and we're doing a version of this with the podcast, with this being our last episode for season 6. Looking back, we covered a lot of topics this year. We do you remember who the first interview for this season was?
Yes, so I think it was the big chief, Dr. Brad McMillan.
Yes, that's an important one. And then from there, we looked at what data do we need when opening new schools, interviewing Principal Kaguya. We had a few episodes on culturally responsive assessment.
Yep.
We had an accountability series. We interviewed Area Superintendent Chris McCabe. We started looking at different data sources, starting with the BIMIS.
Yeah.
Talked about equitable grading, how to assess civics, library data, perception data, and then testing across a number of different states.
Yes. Ooh.
So to kind of reflect on these topics, we're going to dust off our magic lamp.
Yep.
And we're going to cast 3 wishes apiece for a genie related to these episodes.
All right.
So Mellisa, what is your first wish?
So for my first wish, it's sort of centered around something that you frequently bring up each season about the role of assessment. So back in October, when we were unpacking culturally responsive assessments, you said this.
And this makes me think of the interrelated nature of assessment with instruction and curriculum.
Oh, yeah.
And this goes back to, I think someone we mentioned it really in our first episode, but this metaphor of thinking of education as a 3-legged stool.
Yes, yeah.
With instruction, curriculum, and assessment as part of it. And there's a good article on Edutopia that we'll drop in the show notes by Milton Chen that talks about this metaphor. And one of the things that they point out is that assessment remains the least understood of these 3 concepts, primarily because history and policy limit our understanding of its purposes and possibilities. I think this is interesting in many fronts with education, but particularly with culturally responsive instruction, because that's something we've looked at in different ways, as we're going to discuss throughout time, but the assessment has kind of been left off.
Yeah.
And the value of this metaphor is that with the 3-legged stool, if you're missing one, it's going to fall.
Right.
And so I think what we're going to try to do is think about how does what we know about culturally responsive instruction inform how we should think about culturally responsive assessment.
So while there is this intersection of curriculum, instruction, and assessment, you also reminded us that assessment often gets overlooked. And so my first wish is for more time and resources dedicated to assessments, especially as the concept of culturally responsiveness grows.
Yeah. And I thought about this again in our previous episode on testing across states when you were talking about Mississippi.
Yeah.
And how they embedded the assessment into this big program in terms of like science of reading and all that.
Yes.
I think too often we apologize for assessment. We think of it as something that we have to do.
Yeah.
And then as a result, we sometimes leave off thinking about assessment when we are planning, because it's just, one more thing.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
So what about yours? What's your first wish?
All right. So my first wish would be for streamlined resources and guidance to measure cross-cutting skills.
Okay.
And this comes from our episode on how to assess civics.
Yeah.
And us kind of reading that article and grappling back and forth with these, skills that are a little bit harder to pin down, that you can't just make a really simple multiple choice, selected response kind of assessment for. this wasn't really a new conversation for us because we've had versions of this before. How do we assess creativity? How do we assess writing? How do we assess, debating? Any of these kind of skills that can take place in any number of classrooms.
Right.
So for the clip for this one, actually, I'm going to pull from last year. And if you remember, we interviewed students at Wake STEM about their growth with the 4 C's.
Oh, yeah.
And one of them had a sentence that's really stuck with me. So let's hear it really quick.
Okay.
The 4 C's are skills like any other skills, like riding a bike, cooking. You get better at them by practicing.
So I love that clip, and I think it sums up nicely. So when it comes to assessing civics or creativity or writing, whatever it might be, having the resources and guidance to help kids practice. So like with that bike metaphor, give them the bike, give them the instruction, but then also the time to practice with feedback. And that's the assessment piece, right? So formative, interim, and summative assessments on these skills so that we can help kids improve in them the same way that they would improve going from a balanced bike to a tricycle to a normal bike and so on.
I think what struck me about the simplicity of his message, it's almost like a meta message. Like if we think about the work that we do in terms of assessment, we get better at making quality assessments when we just do it.
Yeah.
Right? And so that's what that reminded me of. Like if we want to get better at assessing, we want to get better at looking at data, we just have to do it.
Yeah. And I think it's especially some of these skills like this where they seem hard to do at first. I think that blocks us from doing it. There's an author that I like, Matt Haig. He wrote like The Midnight Library was a big book a few years ago. Mm-hmm. And he wrote, I'm not going to get the exact line, but something like, in order to fall asleep, you have to first pretend to be asleep. And everything in life kind of works like that.
Yes,
and
I like that.
When instead, you end up with insomnia when you're like, I can't sleep. And that prevents you from pretending to fall asleep to kind of start. So in order to assess civics, you got to start by just kind of pretending and starting small, and eventually you'll get there.
Build muscle memory. Yep.
Yeah. Okay. What's your next wish?
So this season, we were able to introduce listeners to another data metric through an episode on social emotional tool called the BIMUS. Mm. And so we not only provided them with this theoretical side of the BIMUS, but we interviewed a school-based counselor who shared a practical lens.
I would like everyone to know that the BIMUS is a tool that should be used as a team. So when I say it's a tool, so it's kind of two things, I guess. But when I say it's a tool, it's not the end of the story, which is true for any data set. But I think especially when you look at things like social emotional learning and cognitive functioning or whatever the category may be, you think, oh, that makes sense for this student. But we really need to dig deeper into that. It's a tool and it's one piece of the puzzle. And it's really important to have that team perspective when you're looking at a big data set like this, because I feel the BIMUS is very comprehensive and there's a lot to it. So it does take a team of professionals to look at this and other data. And then once you're using this as a tool appropriately, it gives you really valuable insight into school needs.
So one of the things I found that in learning about the BIMUS, it also reminded me of Victoria Bernhardt's work around the 4 measures, because initially I was thinking about the BIMUS as like student outcomes, but really and truly, this could be an example of a perception data in how it's collected, right? It's based on either teachers' perceptions of students' behavior, parents' perception of students' behavior, and so it taught me something new about how we look at what can be considered data.
Yeah.
And so for my second wish, I would love to see more assessment literacy resources, kind of like our podcast, to kind of help educators understand that their data should not be the end of the story, like she mentioned, but integrated with other measures to be the beginning, as Gina stated.
Yeah, I like that. And I also like in that clip, that point of just I guess, not working in isolation.
Yes.
A team of people working on this. I think that applies to this perception data, but really any assessment. And there's a lot of forces that nudge us into thinking just of ourselves and the accountability results that we're going to get and the labels that it's going to get connected there. So we have to really consciously try to break out of that to get multiple people at the table to get that students are the shared responsibility kind of thing.
And that nicely ties back to when we were talking about ways to become more culturally responsive.
Yeah.
They talked about that team approach so you can get multiple perspectives.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
All right. So what's about your second one?
So yeah, my next wish is also related to perception data. That's to be able to embed high quality perception data into our accountability systems.
Mm-hmm.
So now maybe this is kind of lowercase a accountability, but just thinking more broadly about how we collect all this data to get a sense of how we're doing. And so for this, I was really influenced by Principal Julie Sexton when she talked about how, she used the district and state provided surveys to kind of get a sense of almost in like a summative way, like how she's doing. But then she also had these kind of localized versions of these throughout the year to kind of track that. And that when it's placed alongside the EOGs and NC check-ins serving a similar purpose, it gives a more like kind of holistic view.
That broad story.
Yeah. And it starts to tell that how and the why. And you had a comment in our accountability series back in October that I think drives this point home.
So, our traditional ESSA data is very limited. Mm-hmm. And so we will always say we need more timely and actionable data. I mean, the fact that we're in October and we're still getting results from the 24-25 year is kind of difficult, right? And so, the 25-26 year have started and people are moving forward. So, how do we provide these frequent checks or opportunities to learn? How do we make sense of that data, but also kind of marry it with where we are now and use data or access data or collect data that's more actionable to where we are right now to kind of keep improving.
So exactly what you were saying, I feel like popped up later in that kind of season. Some high quality perception data can kind of fill that role in an accountability system. I was thinking that if you give a survey on Friday and it reveals that students or parents don't feel welcomed, you can think of a lot of very specific things that you can do that Monday.
Mm-hmm. It made me think about, we use the concept of formative assessments, but I wonder what formative feedback or formative perception data would look like, right? Which I think is what we're doing. You need the data at the moment where you can act upon it.
Yeah.
And so that whole process of, yes, it's good to have summative data, but it's the formative data that you need to kind of inch along to get to those summative places is just as helpful as having the summative pieces.
Yeah. You need both. It makes me think of like the art of good video games. That's what they do. They give users this small feedback that you don't even really realize
right.
in the first few parts of each level to say like, oh, I'm supposed to jump on that weird looking toad guy. And when I do that, this happens. Or if I don't, this happens. You get the summative at the end of the level or the game or something like that. But the game only works if you have that small feedback going. Otherwise, you quit. And I think that applies just as much to school, too. We can't just wait till the end of the year to get that big picture, or we already would have lost the people that were getting hit by those toads.
Yeah. That makes sense.
Yeah.
All right. So for my last one, if you remember back in December, we interviewed one of our district colleagues, Lauren Curtis, to get a sense of how district leaders use data. And so during that interview, Lauren shared this perspective about how she approaches school improvement work.
If you're working as a school leader or the leader of a PLC, like you're not in every classroom every moment. You can't carry the context of every thing that's happening in that room or within that school, everyone has their lens, right? So I think a place of wanting to be curious and be vulnerable and accept, like, I can't solve the problem by myself. We have to solve it together is really key. I think that when you enter a space like that, it's not then an I'm telling, but I'm here to partner and solve together. And I think that that's really key, because having worked in a low performing school, you can't fix every problem immediately, right? And so instead, it's a matter of how are we going to build our efficacy as a group to support our students.
I love how she highlighted the need for vulnerability and partnership. Mm-hmm. And so for my final wish, I would love to see a change in mindsets around school improvement and accountability. You know, in our earlier, I think it was in our first season, we talked about how the word assessment is defined. And we talked about it comes from this Latin word assidere, where you're sitting alongside. Mm-hmm. When she gave that explanation, that's what I envisioned as leaders, as we move forward. To do this work, we have to sit alongside PLCs, alongside other leaders, alongside teachers to help do this work, because nobody can do this work by themselves. Yep. And so that's what I would love to see, a change in mindsets about how we do this work.
Yeah, and that's pretty much the same as my last wish. So I think there's a nice way to kind of tie a bow on this. Mine was the kind of the will and I suppose mindset to measure what matters, to provide the feedback that our students and teachers and schools need to kind of improve outcomes for these kids. Because it strikes me, thinking back on all these wishes, and this wasn't planned, it just kind of worked out this way, that neither of us asked for anything that requires like unlimited funds or these like ambitious, technological leaps to allow us to do this or that with assessment. We can do all these things. We just have to choose to do so.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, yeah.
I think at the end of the day, I think what's coming to my mind is I can do hard things. And I mean, this work is not easy, but we can do hard things and hard things. So
I like that. That's a perfect line, I think, to end this season with. So yeah, Mellisa, thank you for chatting about data and assessments with me throughout this season.
Yeah, thank you. And this has been, I didn't think we always start off the season not thinking we would get to this many episodes. And we somehow find more ways to broaden our listeners' perspectives.
Yeah, and we have more on the list too.
Yeah.
So we already have our season 7 planning doc. So listeners, thank you for tuning in. And if there's anything that you'd like us to touch upon for next season, you can let us know by emailing us at datalit@wcpss.net. I also want to thank Millbrook High School's Tremont Ponton for the theme music that we used throughout this year. It was fantastic. We enjoyed working with him. So listeners, we'll see you next season.
Bye.